Awkward moments are a part of life and not just a phase during our middle school years. And these moments don't always involve doing something embarrassing. They can occur when a teacher encounters a room of silent students after asking a question, or during an entangled conversation with your child when a plan or project has not gone as expected. There are endless examples, and yet these moments can also be times rich with possibility for teaching and discovery, as well as redemption and restoration in our schools and in our homes. Stay tuned for this episode of Basecamp Live.
Mountains, we all face them as we seek to influence the next generation. Get equipped to conquer the challenges, summit the peak, and shape exceptionally thoughtful, compassionate, and flourishing human beings. We call it Ancient Future Education for raising the next generation. Welcome to Basecamp Live. Now your host, Davies Owens.
Well, thanks for joining us for another episode of Basecamp Live. I cannot believe it is our 7th year of podcasting. And it's time for some refreshing and redesigning. And a lot of what we're looking at coming in 2024, 2.0 of Basecamp, been talking about it for a long time, is because of a lot of great input we've received from you. So a huge thank you to the many of you who filled out the survey. There is about 5 days or so left, depending on when you're listening to this podcast. Just go to basecamplive.com and there's a survey. If it's there, then it's not too late. And if you fill it out, it will give you a chance to receive a thank you of a random drawing for a $100 Amazon gift card. But more than anything, just the feedback is super helpful as we kind of think about what is helpful to you as we join you on this journey of raising the next generation. Keith McCurdy and I, as you know, are locking arms, doing more together in terms of podcasting. There's going to be a Live Sturdy podcast. Last week's was a one in a series we're doing with him on various things around what it means to live sturdy in our homes and in our schools. And we're refreshing the format. We're going to video. We're adding resources. Keith and I are getting on the road to come to your schools. Roadshow 2024, you're going to be hearing more about that, kind of a state of the podcast we're going to do at the end of the year. We're going to share all these great ideas. And there's a lot going on. But more than anything, we'd just love to hear from you. info@basecamplive.com is always a way to give me a shout out. I really do love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? What are you up to? What's on your mind? Just take a moment. It means a lot. My guest today, Dave Mathwin, is the Dean of Students and Upper School History at the Ad Fontes Academies in Centreville, Virginia. He has been there since 1998, which is awesome and amazing. A quarter of a century in a classical Christian school. He has a lot of perspective. He and his wife, Linda, have 3 children. And Dave has taught in a variety of subjects over the years, but primarily concentrates on history in the upper school. But as Dean of Students, he's developed a lot of wisdom around leading and guiding students, especially during those awkward moments and during times of chaos. And he's anchored a lot of that thinking out of scripture and has a lot of wisdom to share with us today. I really enjoyed our conversation. I think his great vision is ultimately helping students become the best that God has called them to be. And forming culture and community there at Ad Fontes is a big part of what he does. He also has a website called A Stick in the Mud. It's a weekly overview of his 8th through 12th grade history class. And he's got a book that's brand new coming out this month on this topic that we're talking about today. So without further ado, please join me for this conversation with Dave Mathwin. Dave Mathwin, welcome to Basecamp Live.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you.
You have been faithfully serving in a classical Christian school for how many years?
This is my 26th year. Yeah, it's hard to believe, but 26. That's right.
That is more than a quarter of a century. That is impressive. So I don't know. I hope your school gives you a very nice gold watch or whatever you get at the quarterly mark.
Yeah.
But needless to say, you have seen a lot of students come and go. A lot of students have come to your classrooms and grown up, become adults and moved out into the world. And you have a lot of perspective that maybe we as parents and educators don't always get. And I'd love to hear a little bit about just your journey briefly and sort of this discovery that you've made, which I'm really excited about, of how do we redeem these awkward moments? Because the good Lord knows there's a lot of awkwardness in raising the next generation, both in our home and in our schools. But first, a little bit of your story.
Sure. Thank you very much, Davies. Yeah. So in 1998, I was getting out of grad school and wondered, what do I do now? I'd heard about classical Christian education. Of course, those were the late 90s. It was the Wild West, right, of the classical Christian world. And so, yeah, they hired me. And the great thing about that time was that, it was weird and difficult. And but you could make a lot of mistakes. Certainly, I did make a lot of mistakes in those early years. But you could like enthusiasm and goodwill and from many people, help keep me going. Eventually, I think I started to get my feet, and I began to have what I hope has been some success in the classroom. What I realized I was having a hard time doing was finding a way to help other teachers kind of replicate some of the success that I and other good teachers were having. How like it teaching can be a very kind of individual thing. You're there, it's just you and the class. But how could that how some of the things that I did and then I saw that other great teachers do, how could that be replicated if it's such an individual kind of personal thing in the classroom?
Yeah.
I began to wonder and think, to try and reflect about what I did, why I did it. And I started to make some discoveries through being exposed to some good sources here and there that good teaching, in fact, mirrors the way God made the world. The patterns of good teaching are the patterns of creation itself. Unfortunately, we don't often recognize this because, right, in a post-industrial world, we're kind of isolated from those rhythms. We're inside, enclosed, and very often in our own personal lives, we're not really connected to those rhythms. So how can we get those rhythms back, and how can we map them onto our classroom experience? And I realized when I was doing that, um, that I was having success with students, and that was something then that I could try and talk about with others because that map, that grid, anybody can do it. We all live in the world God made. We're all made in His image.
And specifically, Dave, is again, there's a lot. I know you've got this book coming out, which I'm going to encourage people to get into because you cover a lot of these patterns. But it sounds
Mhm.
like kind of the pattern that was most applicable and most helpful, especially as schools and as parents that tend to be, well, let's be honest, we can be a little bit too perfectionist and too
Mhm.
maybe too mechanistic, and especially as we come through early raising grammar school kids, and the world is very fixed and predictable, and then all of a sudden we wake up and kids have hormones and it's middle school and high school. And, there's a lot of us, both as parents and teachers, that think, uh-oh, the train's coming off the tracks. And what you're finding in these patterns, I'd love for you to unpack this a bit, is really that there is a natural ebb and flow that, even in a pre-fallen world, there was moments
Right.
of sort of unpredictability or chaos. Talk about that in this pattern.
Sure. Well, thank you, Davies. Yes. So, one of the things I did, and I was encouraged to do from other sources, this isn't just my invention, I want to be clear, but you see in Genesis 1 something very interesting. Right in the early chapters, um, the world, like in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was, formless and void. Darkness was over the surface of the darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the earth, the Spirit of God hovered above the waters. This sense, things begin in formlessness. We tend to think of chaos or this kind of formless void, to use that phrase. Well, that must be bad, but it's not, right? Nor is it something distinct from God. In a lot of ancient, pagan creation accounts, the gods or some god has to master chaos outside of its, something that's distinct from it. But this is part of who God is. Now, out of that, God creates distinctions, right? God creates light and dark, light and day, and I mean light and dark. God creates sea and dry land, and birds and fish, male and female. Um, but after creating all those distinctions, then on the seventh day, God stops making distinctions. God lets things be, as it were. God lets things rest. And the striking thing is, Davies, that's the only day, that Sabbath day, that day where things are not worked and order is not created. That's the day that God calls holy. Obviously, all creation is good, but that last day, that's the only day He calls holy. So I thought there must be something there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
order is not the final word, I guess we should say. Yeah.
yeah, that, and I think that's, again, just as folks are following this thinking pattern, it's again, I think there's far too often a tension among parents and honestly as educators that we've kind of, we've got up on our walls these beautiful framed portraits of graduates with all of these amazing accolades, and then we go quote, whoever, Boethius and others, that talks about ordering ourselves and ordering our
Mhm.
families, and the liberal arts teach us to reason and how to order, and we love this. And especially as the world, as the barbarians are at our school gates out there
Mhm.
in utter chaos, like it seems like the last thing we'd want to be promoting is chaos. It seems like we're the order people. In fact,
Right.
the crazy, and you see this in some of our, in the broader, I guess, patterns within classical Christian education, is you see a clamping down, like we're gonna make sure that we're incredibly tight on everything, and we're gonna reinforce justice and temperance and prudence and courage, and like we're gonna get more prune faced, and we're gonna have harder rules. It feels like, grammar school never ends in that world, as opposed to
Yes.
maybe we allow our students to move into these ages of more, I guess a little bit more what Charlie Mason calls joyful discovery. And then some of that
Right.
is we might, trip along the way, or we might have an awkward moment along the way. So
Absolutely.
talk about, in your book, you talk about an awkward moment you had with some boys in the hallway. Like what
Right.
was that? Give us an example of what an awkward moment looked like.
Right. Yes. Thank you. So, I mean, again, this particular moment, it can happen anywhere. It happens all the time in any school. But I was walking down the hall, and this kind of one of our longer hallways, right? And at the far edge, I saw some eighth grade boys, and there were three of them, and um, and they were kind of playing a kind of human billiards with each other. Like one guy on one end was knocking into the middle guy, and the middle guy knocked into the third guy. And the third guy would kind of fall into the wall and laugh and so on. And then he reversed the process, and they kind of did this walking down the hall. And I thought, well, this is pretty funny, but but they can't do that, right? And then of course they jostle into a tiny seventh grade girl or something like that, and she drops her notebook, but they're totally oblivious to all this. So I eventually, okay, so they knocked into someone. They can't do this. So I was like, hey, gentlemen, stop. Well, of course, they don't hear the word gentleman. However, like, Gus, Bill, Steve, those weren't their real names, but, like, oh, wait, huh, what? You know, and they're just kind, it's like I woke them up out of a nap, right? Like, what, sir, yes, what, yes, guys, like, what were you doing? That was a dumb question, right? That's not direct enough. They have no idea. Like, they look at each other like, what were we just doing? Like, I don't know. And so, like, playing this out with them, like, just realizing, wait a second, they were so oblivious to what was happening. In fact, I said, like, well, don't do that again. They start walking away, but I turned back, like, wait a second, I better check on them. And sure enough, they start doing this process all over again. I'll be like, hey, Gus, Bill, Steve, what are you doing? And they were like, oh, what, sir, yes. I said, guys, remember, just because you can't see me doesn't mean that I can't see you. And this totally like perplexed them. Like, what? What's going on? Like, can he do that? Can he see people if I can't see people? Like, it's just totally, totally in this weird headspace. But that moment, right? I didn't punish them. They were just clueless guys. But that moment, like, they thought this idea, this connect, like that moment is, it doesn't have to be all tied up. In other words, it doesn't have to reach a specific conclusion because you're dealing with guys, perhaps, well, guys and gals. In this instance, it was guys that are hardly aware of even their own bodies. I thought for me to clamp down in that moment, it would have been very counterproductive. Like, it wouldn't have landed with them because they had no particular, they're not even aware of what they're doing. And that might seem a little bit scary, like, because we don't want them to bump into people or something like that. And that's true, but that's who they are and that's where they're at. We just have to, I think, expect and almost accept these moments and try, if we can, to pivot them
And that's
rather than trying to prevent them, I guess, would
that
be
I love that phrase, pivot rather than prevent, because again, this is whether we're parents or we are educators, especially if we're used to living in a grammar school world where I think, again, I'm broad generalizations here, but you tend to have a little bit more classroom management looks a certain way. You walk in
right.
rows. There's a lot more prescription over what the day looks like. And then to the frame of the child we're trying to teach you, you've got adolescent boys are full of energy and they've probably been sitting at a desk all the last 50
Right.
minutes. And now, if you just come in as the grumpy rule, guys,
Yes.
I'm going to write you up, or you've missed really a moment. I think this is the point of the podcast here is
Yeah.
are there moments, redemptive moments that we miss because we're so caught up in
Right.
enforcing a very narrow, maybe right standard. And again, I want to be sure what people are hearing is not, like, who's this Dave guy? He's just advocating, you know, he's kind of
Just let
this,
them teach you whatever.
left wing,
Mhm.
child-centered education guy. Like, what are you talking
No,
about? Like, no, we're
right.
talking about redeeming the time around the frame of the child, right? Is that the way to
Yes.
say it? Yeah.
Well, yeah, and around, shall we say, around this pattern of creation. And yeah, I want to be clear. A teacher's job is to create an ordered environment so that, um, right. So yeah, you can't learn in a chaotic environment, but a teacher's job is also like to know when day 7 has come, to know when you have to, in a sense, let that order, in a sense, die, or or recognize when that order needs to be refreshed in order for
Yeah.
it to be real,
Yeah.
right? That's, I think, something that teachers miss
Hmm.
sometimes. We're so focused on maintaining order, maintaining structure, and
Yeah.
yet God wants us to sometimes let that order and that structure
Yep.
dissipate, not
Yeah.
for the sake of no structure, but for the sake of renewing that structure.
Well, and just reframe. I think that whatever the word pivoting or reframing, all of that, I
Yeah.
think is what we're talking about. So, Dave, why don't we take a quick break? I want to come back because I want to talk. You had a couple more great classroom examples. We'll talk more about what this looks like at home. But honestly, I love this because I think it frees us up, not from aiming for standards and excellence in any way, but just having a little bit more grace and recognizing this sort of refining fire that we're all going through is not always perfect and simple. And God has a way of redeeming the time, which is beautiful. We'll be right back in this conversation with Dave. I want to mention an organization that I'm really excited to be partnering with. Most of us engage with businesses every day that provide excellent services, but are all too often actually funding initiatives and ideologies that are out of alignment with what we deeply value as families and churches and schools. And that's why Basecamp Live is proud to partner and do our banking with America's Christian Credit Union, a banking institution that only serves and invests in kingdom causes. So whether you're managing a school, a home, a small business, ACCU can meet your banking needs while upholding your biblical values. Find out why tens of thousands of families and ministries across the country have chosen to bank with ACCU by visiting americaschristiancu.com/basecamp. So, Dave, there are lots of awkward moments. Probably the universal awkward moment that, from a teaching standpoint, but I think it's true in the home too, that we tend to not feel comfortable with as adults is just silence. Like, we ask a question and no one answers. And okay, well, let me answer the question. And then that just kills the classroom really fast. Or at home, you ask a question and, maybe you're trying to discipline or guide your child and they're just not wanting to answer you. Well, maybe it's okay to let silence linger longer. Has that been your experience as well?
Sure. Yes, absolutely. So I can talk about, yeah, so I'll talk about being a teacher first and then being a parent second.
Great.
Um, right. Teachers want order. They work on their lesson plans. They want to see them work. Um, but what I think I've noticed is that it's okay if they're not working and to recognize when they're not working. And in a sense, right, to let your idea, your plan die. So, like, I've taught ancient history to 8th graders for, geez, probably more than 20 years. I love the class. I love the age group. Um, and I've kind of perfected, quote unquote, my opening day routine where I kind of frame the year and ask some questions and it works, right? I keep doing it because it works. brows, furrow, hands raised. Wait a second, are you saying this or that? It works great, except one year when it didn't work. It didn't work at all. And the eyes are glazed over. No one cares. Their arms are at their sides, and when an environment, when it's not working. And so maybe you try something and you keep going, and then you're like, oh, it just feels so heavy. You look at the clock and you're like, well, maybe class is almost over, and you're like, oh man, nope, I've got like 48 minutes left to go. So I thought, okay, I need to first of all, silence works really well. Just let something be. Silence can reframe attention. So I stopped talking for about, 10, 15 seconds, and that got a little bit of their attention. And I thought to myself, I need to hit the reset button. I want to get back to talking about history, but I can't do that right now. No one cares about that. There's no energy. There's no life there. So I asked a question: how many of your parents, or did any of your parents buy the Aquafresh Ultra Clean toothpaste that was on sale at Costco this week?
That's in the classical curriculum book, right?
That's absolutely in the book.
Yeah.
Well, this was a coupon. If any parents out there know Costco, buy in bulk, these monthly coupons. And we had bought it ourselves, bought 8 tubes of it, but it was so intense. It was such as this massively intense, burning your gums as well as removing plaque. So I was hoping, reasonably suspecting that some of them would do it. And a few tentative hands are raised. So I was like, okay, that's good. That's good. I said, did it, of course, maybe you have to say did it burn your mouth? I was praying, please, 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 please. And then someone brought this out yes, yes. I used it and I couldn't taste it. My mouth was burning. I said, Mom, I can't use this kind of toothpaste. And she's like, well, you have to use it. No, I don't care. But Mom, it's burning my mouth. Use it anyway. And everybody starts jumping in. I like this, Colgate, Crest, Aquafresh, whatever. So in some ways, right, this is chaos, but it's not the same thing. First of all, I've got life. Second of all, they are actually talking about something that I introduced. So that's a win. And then, of course, then that dies out. Now I've got their attention again, and they say, well, Mr. Mathwin, why'd you bring that up? I said, well, for no reason. It was just something on my mind. And speaking of things on my mind, history is actually, the study. And of course, they groan ugh. But groaning is the proper response. And now at least I've got life back in the classroom. I've got energy again. I can work with that. And so I think that example, right, I had to recognize that something was dead and it needed reborn. So bury it. Like you bury a seed in the ground, that's how you get plants. So bury it, call it, and find a way to pivot it. And so for the rest of the year, actually, that moment, worked for me. Mr. Mathwin, we're going to talk about toothpaste in class again. I was like, well, wait and see, come to class and find out, just
right.
Because it was a kind of real moment, we might say. But right, it was a real moment to get to create a kind of energy to get to, talking about, the Egyptians or something like that, right? Yeah.
Well, and again, I mean, it's the old adage: the one who does the thinking does the learning. And so, I mean, you're really jump starting or pivoting, again, whatever word we want to use, sort of a static moment to where now there's engagement on both sides. You happen to use toothpaste to do it. I mean, maybe you could have pivoted to whatever they used for toothpaste, 500 years ago, or I mean, maybe you could figure out a way back into history. But
yeah,
the point is there's sort of life on life engagement, and maybe the rules as we think of school is, again, kind of wooden, maybe, to use that comparison. It's
right.
Very much like, if we don't stay on this piece of paper and within these 4 sets of questions on the learning objectives, then we've somehow made an egregious error. But you're saying there's a place for some grace in there as we
right.
have conversation.
Kind of there's room for that day of rest. There's room for casting your bread upon the waters. And I have 3 children, 2 of which went through the school where I teach, K to 12. And so I've had the lower school experience and the upper school experience. And I remember the days of like lower school homework time where it can be frustrating. And I remember being like, get to like, the answer is 5. Can't you see? Like, we just
Right.
kind of want to get through. And then that transition, I wish I had been a little bit more like, I'll just work it out. It'll be fine. If you get the wrong answer, that's fine. Just let them. And then, of course, as they get older, you have to you have to reset things. You have to let things, 8th grade isn't the same as 4th grade. And you have to be willing to let things be a little bit messy before they can be. You have to let something die, some degree of order die before it can be reborn again. Before you got to go through 8th and 9th grade before you can get to
Yeah.
senior year. Yeah.
And do you think in general, I'm saying this very broadly, but our schools maybe do a disservice to both parents and maybe teachers too, that we have an expectation set that sounds a lot like hyper order and structure all the way through 12th
Right.
grade. And we don't have any allowances or expectations that, wait a minute, they're going to hit 5th grade or 6th grade and they're going to start using that logic and this questioning skills we've trained them in, and they become a little bit less eager to just embrace everything, and it gets awkward. And then a lot of parents, I think increasingly are well, if it's awkward, we just need to go find a new school. This is just not going to work.
Oh, that's a great point. I think, right. The awkwardness could actually mean that the school is doing something right. I really believe that. Because if you just see hyper order, we might say, or order all the way down the line, that's not how God made the world. And so that's not how schools should function. And that's not how our kids are going to function and our students are going to function. So, right, I would say if you see a school where there's some awkwardness, where the teacher changed plans and scrapped something and decided to do something else because of something a student said, or if there's experimentation, or if they're right, that's the kind of school I think you want to send your kids to, because that's allowing kids to kind of explore, to grow, and to become partners in this process. It's not just coming from the teacher to the student. It's coming from the teachers and the students kind of working together and reforming, like, I don't want to say a new person, but like a kind of a person now who is a student who, is not what they were in 8th grade.
Yeah.
So I agree. Look for awkwardness.
Right.
If you don't see it, that could be the problem. Yeah.
And I think, well, let's go to another break. I want to come back and talk about this again, sort of in light of the overall trajectory of the school. And when you get to 12th grade, again, is everything as neat and tidy as the portrait of the graduate, or maybe there's still some refinement still going on? And is that okay? Or does that feel like maybe it's not? So let's unpack that, because this is a freeing conversation, Dave. I really appreciate you bringing it up, because I think we all look at our kids and go, well, our kids aren't like that, but everybody else seems like their kids are, boy, I don't know if this is working for us. And it's like, hold on, wait a minute. Maybe this is exactly where God is showing up the most. So we'll be right back and continue our conversation with Dave.
What if your students could find a college where education is rooted deep in the soil of faith? What if your students could be guided to deeper learning by teachers who weren't just smart, but wise? What if the higher education journey pushed your students to excellence and joy, even amid extraordinary effort? That's what happens every day at Samford University. For 182 years, Samford has equipped our students with the knowledge, skills, relationships, and experiences they need to tackle society's greatest challenges. See the Samford difference. Visit samford.edu/realize. That's samford.edu/realize. Samford, for God, for learning, forever.
What does Athens have to do with Africa? Would you like to be a part of the global classical Christian movement? The Rafiki Foundation is providing classical Christian education across 10 countries in Africa to underprivileged children. We provide preschool to high school education, Bible study, 2 meals a day. We like to say the best education for the least of these. Rafiki provides opportunities for classical Christian schools, educators, and families to participate in this movement, either by helping children providing scholarships for children to go to these classical Christian schools in Africa, or by going yourself for 2 weeks, 2 months, or 2 decades. Find out more at the Rafiki Foundation website or the Rafiki Foundation podcast. Thanks. This is Karen Elliott, the Executive Director.
Dave, I appreciate this message of sort of finding hope in the midst of awkward moments, redeeming awkward moments. God's full of grace, and we're all imperfect people on this journey. At the same time, I know you're not giving us just permission to be sloppy. You're just saying, just hold on. Let's recognize that this is a process we're under. And I definitely see this kind of tension, I suppose, as students age into their junior and senior year, and families look around and they go back again to the portrait of the graduate on the wall, and they think, well, that person's, or my child be particular, doesn't exude all these behaviors. Maybe there's some things, but I know they still struggle in this other area. Talk about again this process that we're under. It doesn't mean that the school failed or you failed.
That's very true. Sure, my own kids are wonderful. They're great. And, when they graduated from AFA, they were not all that they were, they're not fully finished products. And of course, neither are you and I. I do think that, our schools talk a lot about beauty, and which is great. And we think of beauty sometimes as, sometimes I think we can think of beauty as something that's too static. And yet, when we think about a great story, the stories we love, there are messy moments in those stories. Sometimes bad things happen. Sometimes the heroes of the stories do things they shouldn't do or get in trouble, but that's not the end. That's sometimes, just the beginning of something greater that's going to happen. So too with great pieces of music. Sometimes there's some dissonance, right? But that dissonance isn't for the sake of dissonance only. Of course, it's so that we can see that resolution come. And then when that does come, that becomes a very powerful thing. So this process, this participation in this pattern of allowing for some messiness, allowing for some things to rest, to become unformed, that is going to be beautiful, because that's how God made the world. That's the world we have to live in. So when we see that messiness, it can be nerve-wracking. I mean, I'm a parent of 3, and absolutely, there are moments of anxiety, nervousness. You wonder if it will be resolved. But we can't, there's no alternative. We can't keep them in their cribs for forever. We can't keep them indoors for forever. We have to let things be, as it were. And when you get those great moments as a parent, as a teacher, boy, that wait for that resolution, it's all worth it. And so, I think if we think of beauty, if we reframe it a little bit, we'll start to see that pattern and live into that pattern and notice the great things God has for us in those patterns.
At the end of the day, it's the gospel at its most basic level. I mean, it's
absolutely
it's redemption out of brokenness and out of chaos, and that's
yep.
And if we never acknowledge there's going to be brokenness and chaos, then we don't really make a lot of room for redemption. So
absolutely,
that's really what this journey that we're on as parents and as teachers along the way.
No question. Yeah. The crucifixion is, on the one hand, the worst and the best thing, right? And it's right. God entered into that pattern of death and resurrection. We have to enter into it as teachers, as students, as parents. Right. But from that, comes new life. If we're willing to wait for it. Yep.
Well, and I think just examining, again, a lot we can say, but just as we kind of close out our time, I mean, obviously we want to look to the source of that struggle. I mean, is it a student that's, struggling because we've signed them up for 3 travel team sports and they don't have time for school? I mean, is that why the struggle is there, or is the struggle because they're just trying to understandably figure out who they are in a complicated world, and that's a different reason? I mean, I think we got to take the time to unpack that, certainly. but there is grace along the way in that journey. So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. I think when we're reaching this unformed state and we're unsure, we tend to think that things are wrong. That might not be the case. It might just be, right? This is this day of rest, this day of things being unformed. We wait for it, wait for things to turn. I think we'll see great things for our students and for our families.
yeah. Well, I love it, Dave. Well, thanks for your time. I love it. I'm every time I see a tube of Aquafresh, I'm going to think of you in that moment. Like that's, if all else fails, check out what was sold at Costco last week. That'll get them talking. So
That's right.
but things like that are a great example of jump starting and refreshing the conversation, reframing it as it may be. For folks that are curious about your book, tell them it's coming out here real soon. Where can they find out more?
Right. Well, it's going to be available on Amazon, and the title of the book is "The Classroom as Cosmos: Teaching as Pattern Application," and the book is basically seeking to say how God made the world is how our classrooms should function, how our lives, should function in families. But it's specifically kind of focused on classrooms. But I hope that whoever reads the book, educators, parents, will find things that will apply to their lives. So I hope that people will find it interesting, but more importantly, useful in their day-to-day life.
Gosh, Dave, thanks so much. It is really, it is a word of good news, I believe, that we needed to hear. And again, the truth, goodness, and beauty that we strive for is absolutely there, and there's confidence in that, and there's grace along the way when things are not perfect, and we thank you for that. So thanks for your message and for your time, Dave. We look forward to continuing conversation with you in the future.
Thank you very much, Davies. It's been wonderful to speak with you, and thank you so much for this opportunity. Much appreciated.
Hey everybody, my name is Grant and I'm the producer of Basecamp Live. I want to thank you all so much for listening to this episode and remind you to take our survey, which we just released on our website. You can also find it in the show notes. This gives you an opportunity as the listener to tell us what you want to see more of and what you want to see less of potentially. Also, don't forget to give Basecamp Live a rating on your podcast app and share it with your friends. Thanks so much.